Hi, this is Steve Sherwood, and Rochelle Staley asked if I would just take a few minutes and give some thoughts about uh, kind of the upcoming Easter season and Jesus's death on the cross and resurrection, and why that has been a big central thing for Christians throughout the centuries, and maybe some different ways to think about it. Because I think one of the things that a lot of us have troubles with or struggles with. And I know I have, both kind of starting when I was younger, but really all through my adult life, is some of the ways that we as Christians sometimes talk about the cross as sort of this, like almost cosmic child abuse sort of thing. That like this idea that God is so angry with humanity that He desires to just beat the crap out of us, and that we're like guilty in a court of law, or just God is furious with us and desires to kill us, desires to destroy us. But at the very last minute, he decides he's willing to kill his son instead. That Jesus, his innocent son, sort of steps in and takes this brutal beating and brutal death on the cross, um, on our behalf, because God just hates us so much and is so angry with us. But somehow everything's made good and right by Jesus just getting the shit beat out of him essentially on our behalf. Um, and that is kind of an exaggerated form of one way that Christians do sometimes talk about the cross. And it's this idea called penal substitution. And penal is sort of like legal or courtroom, or like penalty, is sort of what the penal substitution represents. So that Jesus substitutes for us in the court of God's wrath or God's judgment. Um, but here's the thing, like that's really a very recent, like just the last couple hundred years, it really has that become, and particularly in America, has that become sort of the dominant way that a lot of Christians talk about the cross and talk about who Jesus is. In the early church, and that this is what I'd like to talk about tonight. Just one of the ways that the early Christians thought about all of this, and they thought about it very differently, and in fact, completely differently than what I just described to you. In the early church, there were kind of two ideas about Jesus's birth, life, death, and resurrection that were really, really predominant, and they're a whole lot different than that kind of penal substitution idea. And the first idea is this idea of rescue. Okay, like sometimes if you're reading kind of church history, you'll hear about ransom. The early Christians thought of Jesus as kind of performing or providing a ransom for us. So in some way, like that we were held captive. Like if you look around, like we're all captive in our homes right now with the coronavirus, right? Like we're held captive by things that are wrong in the world, and held captive by evil, or held captive by Satan, perhaps even in our sin, in our brokenness, in our death, and that Jesus comes to rescue us from that. And so a lot of kind of the early ways that kind of the earliest Christian sermons talking about Jesus' death and whatnot, the earliest Christian writings often use this language of rescue or ransom. That we are, rather than God desiring to punish us, God desires to rescue us from all that's wrong with the world, rescue us from ourselves and our own brokenness and sinfulness, but also just rescuing us from all that's broken around us, both so things that are within, but also things on the outside. And I think this coronavirus kind of time is an example of that. Like something's wrong with the world. Like we're not supposed to live in a world where people have to hide themselves away from one another to keep from disease destroying us, right? And so this idea that part of what Jesus is about is this rescuing of humanity, um, from captivity to sin, captivity to Satan, captivity to death. And now, obviously, the fact that 2,000 years later, we are, holed up and held captive, um, in some way signifies that there's this idea that Christians talk about called already but not yet, right? That Christ has already performed this rescue for us. that Jesus' death on the cross, Jesus is entering into our human existence. Um, it begins this rescue, and it is going to be completed in the future, completed when Christ returns again. But this first idea of the early Christians was this ransom or rescue idea, and a second one that in some ways is kind of related, and in a lot of ways is maybe even more germane or particular to what's going on right now, is this idea of kind of a good infection, right? So if you think about like how coronavirus is spreading through our society, right? Like it starts in one place and just, you know, one person touches or is with several others, and it spreads, and it multiplies and just gets bigger and bigger. Well, that's also kind of like how disease works in our body, right? Like if you have a cancer cell, it starts in one tiny part of your body and then starts to move itself out, and eventually, if unstopped, kind of corrodes and destroys everything, right? And leads to death. And the way disease kind of starts small and just begins working its way through the body and ends in destroying and decay, and destruction, right? So if that's how disease works, the early Christians thought that Jesus kind of performed the opposite. And really, as much at Jesus's birth as at his death. They talked about kind of this idea of recapitulation or recreating humanity. That when Jesus comes and is born, you know, that Jesus is God in the flesh. When God takes on human flesh, he kind of starts this process of reversing the contamination that had entered the world through sin, right? That if sin is like this cancer cell that's kind of working its way and destroying all humanity ultimately, that Jesus's birth begins this process of kind of this good disease, this good infection, kind of working its way out, first in the person of Jesus and then through Jesus into all humanity. And that begins with his birth and an idea that's called the incarnation, right? So incarnation is just kind of Latin for incarnate, in flesh. If you have chili con carne, chili with flesh, with meat, that Jesus is God in the flesh, and that starts this kind of positive or healthy infection that starts working its way into all of humanity and then works its way out. Another image that I've heard for kind of this early Christian way is imagine, I don't know if any of you followed the news story about a year and a half ago, of these kids in Indonesia, this soccer team that got stuck in a cave, right? And they were trapped in this cave, and then it flooded, and so they couldn't escape. And so divers had to go in and rescue them. But the divers, they were expert swimmers and expert, you know, cave navigators and whatnot. But the kids were not. They were young, they were sick, they were terrified, they weren't great swimmers. So what the divers had to do was kind of tie the kids to them, right? So one diver would have one kid sort of lashed to himself, tied to himself, and they would share oxygen, and they would sedate the kid. So the kid is sort of, the kid being rescued would be unconscious and tied to a diver who would then swim his way, navigate his way through the cave, sort of carrying that soccer player, that young teenage boy, kind of out of the cave, both sharing oxygen together, but also the swimmer kind of swimming on behalf of the kid. So the kid is really totally passive. In fact, they were sedated so much that, you know, they were unconscious. They were breathing through this respirator that was attached to the diver's, you know, oxygen tank and whatnot. And then the diver would do all of the swimming. So the early church kind of talked about Jesus in the same way. They would talk about how, like, when Jesus is born, like God ties himself to humanity. You know, like that when Jesus is God and human in the flesh bound together, that kind of like God ties himself or binds himself to us, to our humanity. And that at his death, he kind of enters into the death that we experience. He enters into all the suffering and isolation and pain of human experience and death. But then when he rises from the dead, he kind of carries us. He goes down into death with us because he's tied to us. but then comes out into life through his resurrection and carries us out on the other side. And so, just as these cave rescuers, would tie themselves to the soccer players way back, in the depths of the cave, and then dive into the water, dive into the death that was, this flooded cave, but then emerging on the outside into new life and kind of bringing these soccer players with him. And in the same way, the early Christians thought that Jesus binds himself to humanity in his birth and then remains bound to us in his death, that he dies along with us. He dies a human death, but then carries all humanity into new life. So there are a lot of really fascinating, I think, and beautiful ways that in the first several centuries, Christians talked about who Jesus was and why his birth, God in the flesh, was significant, and why his death and resurrection were significant. And there's a whole lot of ways of thinking about it other than kind of that cosmic child abuse or, God as this angry judge in a courtroom that just wants to, beat the crap out of humanity. And in fact, that's a very late or recent way that Christians started talking about it. And I think a really unfortunate one. There's a bunch of other ways as well that Christians have thought about all this stuff through the centuries. But if you find yourself kind of troubled by that courtroom sort of language, well, you don't have to believe that. There's a lot of other great ways to think about who Jesus is and how his death and resurrection matter to us. Thanks.